Hello, I'm Nigel Kobold, and this is the Meteor Knight. This build is both extremely fun to play, with a ton of versatility to handle different situations, really high single target damage with an incredible gap closer, and strong defenses with a great shield and 53 poise. It is a blast. We're going to start with the star of the show, the new ancient meteoric ore greatsword, then talk about our shield, casting tools, armor, talismans, and finally spells, which is where a lot of the versatility comes into the build. The ore greatsword is an interesting weapon. It's a colossal sword requiring 35 strength, 16 intelligence, and 10 dexterity to wield. It primarily scales with strength and arcane, both getting a B scaling at plus 10, and marginally dexterity with an E scaling. It's among the heaviest of the colossal swords with a weight of 22, only a couple other swords are heavier at 23. That said, it has an excellent moveset. It has a thrust on the heavy attack, both for one-handed and two-handed, and it's got exceptional single target assassination with the weapon art White Light Charge. This weapon art has two parts. The first is a significant distance charge, which does pretty high damage and costs 10 FP. It's got fairly solid tracking, and it's going to follow most enemies, only faltering with the really quick ones that kind of jump around. Worth noting here too, the charge is a bit unwieldy when you're not locked on, so generally you're going to want to lock on for this. The charge tends to make enemies flinch, and it's a great combo to just use the charge to gap close and provide an opening to transition either into a heavy attack or a chain of light attacks. Just subjectively, it feels like the light attack actually comes out really quickly after using the charge, which is great. The second part is a short-range burst of light that generates from the middle of the blade, and it does cost a pretty hefty 25 FP. That said, this does crazy high damage, but it's generally only going to hit the enemy you've charged into. The hitbox for it does seem to be pretty small, and like I said, really starts from the middle of the blade. The full combo of this weapon art does an immense amount of damage, and you can just instantly assassinate a lot of enemies. It's really great when you're in a situation with groups of tough enemies to just be able to rush in and immediately remove one of them from the fight before it's even started. And yeah, the full combo just does insane damage. Even if they're not killed, they're probably going to be pretty low. The weapon art's damage is not affected by strength, so the damage is the same if you're one-handing or two-handing it, which is nice because it lets you keep your great shield on more of the time. The charge portion is pretty affordable at 10 FP, and I find this is what I use most out in the world, is just to fly into enemies, hit them with a few light attacks or a heavy attack, and it's a really fun playstyle. It gives you high mobility, and you can use it for quite a long time. For a shield, I'm using the red main great shield. I would love to use the new black steel great shield. It looks so good with the weapon and the armor, but it just weighs too much. It's 19.5 weight. The red main great shield, by comparison, has pretty comparable guard boost. It starts at 65. The black steel starts at 69. Nice. But comes in at a meager 14 weight by comparison. It has pretty average guards across magic, armor, lightning, and holy in the low 50s, but a high 70 on fire, which is actually pretty good for decent sections of the DLC. As for casting implements, we are using both the Dragon Communion Seal and the Albinoric Staff, as we have high arcane, it's our highest stat, and both of these scale exceptionally well with it. As for armor, we're using the Knight's Cavalry helm and chest piece. They look so good with the sword, it's hard not to. I know it's not DLC items, but you've got to pick for fashion sometimes. Alongside the Perfumer gloves and the Page trousers. Like I said, mostly because it looks good, but when we combine with the Bullgoat Talisman, it brings us above the 51 poise breakpoint, so we're not getting staggered constantly. It allows us to easily trade with this big weapon, and it also allows us to keep our weight light enough to manage wielding such a heavy weapon and a great shield, and still medium roll. For Talismans, we're going to run Shard of Alexander for the increase to White Light charge. It's just too much damage to pass up, and when you're on bosses, you'll definitely still use your regular attacks. You're still going to use charge heavy attacks and guard counters, but you're going to be trying to use this Ash of War as much as you can. We also use Bullgoat's Talisman, like I said, to bring our poise above the 51-point breakpoint. We use Greatjar's Arsenal because we need it. We have a lot of heavy gear, and it is worth it, in my opinion. Out in the world, I like to keep the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman on for the FP regeneration. You can swap this out if you have a different preference, but you only actually need 5 FP to use the charge portion of our weapon skill. And so for a lot of time, I can run around kind of at, air quotes, 0 FP, and with the regeneration from it, you essentially can use the charge every 10 seconds, which I like for running around in the world. I just don't have to think about it. And in certain situations where things are hectic and you're not really getting a chance to use a flask, it can be nice to have that recharging. I sometimes do use it on bosses, but generally I will swap to a defensive talisman. I think Pearl Drake or Dragon Crest are both great defaults, but once you know what type of defense you need against the boss, using a more specific defensive talisman will go a long way. Before you get into spells, I'm going to quickly go over our stats, because it really affects the spell options that we get. I'm currently level 181, Starless Confessor, so some things might change with your class minimums. I'll have the level 150 stats beside mine if you are staying at that level. The minimums we need to meet are 35 Strength, 10 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, and 26 Faith. Technically 16 Arcane as well, but we're going to put this higher, and 30 Endurance is there as that's the break point where we're still capable of medium rolls. Assuming you're like me and continuing to level up, I would focus on increasing Arcane to 80 as our Ash of War and spells scale with it, and from then, take whatever you want. More health, more strength, all of them good options. Getting into spells, I always like to take a healing spell while running the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman. It often translates into some free healing when you kind of get to that phase of exploration after killing some enemies. I like to take Lord's Heal. It's the most bang for my buck I can get. I like to take a Dragon's Breath option. You can take your pick. I often go with Rotten Breath to apply Scarlet Rot. It's got a wider cone with slightly less range compared to the main version, which I find a little easier to use. And to my knowledge, they both apply the same amount of rot buildup. This also covers our area of effect when we need to wipe out a group of small enemies. I always take both Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Bow, very solid buffs. While Flame Grant Me Strength doesn't affect our Ash of War, our weapon does do purely physical damage, so it does still get a great benefit, and of course, Golden Vow is always good. I am taking Flame Cleanse Me, as I really do not like not having a quick answer to Rotten Poison, but I will say there hasn't been a ton of Rotten Poison in the DLC. I'm getting close to finishing it, and while there has been some, it's not been a lot. So you could swap this out for something else if you'd like. Next I take Golden Arcs, and this is a cheap, spammable spell that deals decent damage and has pretty solid tracking. Against undead, it really shines, and it has an incredibly long range, and I kind of use it as a replacement for having a bow equipped. It also deals respectable stance damage when charged, and I think is kind of underrated. I think a lot of people wanted this to be like quite powerful, but really it's kind of, I think, an easier alternative to Frenzied Blast. Damage really isn't too much worse. Next up, we take Roar of Regalia, and I will say this is a very specific situation spell. It doesn't do great damage. I totally understand if you want to drop it, but in situations where you are getting swarmed, you've maybe gotten yourself into a bit of a tight spot, if you can find just enough time to get this spell off, it'll stagger all of the enemies, it'll knock them back, and it can often let you get out of a tight spot. It's just run away. We're not here for the damage, we're here for creating space. Take it if you want, leave it if you want. After this, we go with the classic Swarm of Flies. We're into Arcane. We might as well have Bleed build up. It's a great spell. You know it, you love it. Next up is a new one, Pest Thread Spears. Much like the predecessor of the Pest Thread spells, these absolutely rip large enemies apart. I hated the Furnace Golems until I got this spell. They pierce, they can hit large enemy models multiple times for very high damage. And this is why we have 26 Faith. This spell, very, very good. Lastly, our single sorcery, and I will say you can bring others in if you want them, but this one is good enough. I think it's worth carrying the Albinoric staff just for one spell, is Impenetrable Thorns. This can do immense damage in the right situations, particularly against a lot of bosses. It comes out relatively quickly, and you want to get enemies close enough that all 3 of the thorn projectiles hit them. It can hit like a truck. It procs bleed. Very good. And that's the build. It is so incredibly fun to play. You feel like you have a good answer for every situation, and like the general gameplay loop of charging in, swinging this massive hunk of ore feels great. The armor, in my opinion, looks pretty great, all the while having 51 poise and still getting to use a great shield. Having a great shield in this DLC just, I find so nice. It really helps you out, particularly with the new deflecting Hardtear. I know you can get a lot of value out of this with smaller shields, but I love it with great shields too. I absolutely use that. I also will probably recommend using the Opaline Hardtear in your flask alongside it. It's just worthwhile to go for the defenses in this DLC. It makes it so much more survivable and so much more enjoyable. And this build can really take on anything the game throws at it. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like. And if you're so inclined, leave me a comment. Maybe a pun or a bad joke about ore or rocks.
This is not a rock. This is a mineral for like the 10th time.
If you'd like to hear about more Elden Ring builds that are min-maxed for fun in the future, subscribing might not be the worst thing you do today, and I'd certainly be thrilled about it. Links to the wiki for anything I mention will be in the description for if you haven't found them yet. And good luck.